But as the Enlightenment mentality really settled in and got its roots down in Western culture in the following century or two, Hume's ideas really became kind of the last word on miracles for many people. So he was very, very influential up until about the last 40 years or so. So the claim that science denies the possibility of miracles then is not a scientific claim. It's a philosophical claim that's just following in the footsteps of David Hume's philosophical claims. So David Hume's claims were philosophically based, they weren't scientifically based. And so the person who denies the possibility of miracles is not doing so on the basis of science. Hello. Welcome to this class of Persuasive Faith. I'm Rick Harvey, the teacher here in our local church. In this series of lessons, we are exploring the credibility of the Christian faith. If you find this lesson helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want to make sure you see future lessons, be sure to subscribe. If you would like a copy of the slide notes from this class, there's a link in the description below. Now, today's class. So, as it says, today we're going to talk about miracles and science and a little bit of philosophy. And this is, as I mentioned, this is our last lesson on the subject of science and apologetic questions related to science. And then next week we'll go into our section on the authority and credibility and inspiration of the Scriptures. So I've got several resources there. Some of these are really, well, they are helpful, but some of them are really helpful. Eric Metaxas is a New York Times best-selling author, and he has written a really good book on miracles. And he talks a little bit about just the whole idea and the philosophy behind whether or not miracles are possible, that sort of thing, the arguments against miracles. But the bulk of his book is actually testimonies of people he knows. So they're actually people he personally knows, including himself, who have experienced miracles in their lives. And so that's a very fascinating, enjoyable book. John Lennox, famous author, scientist from Oxford, and great Christian apologist, has written a couple books that deal with the question of miracles, God's Undertaker and Gunning for God. Frank Turek, who's a Christian apologist, has his website. On his website, he has a podcast in which he talks I think it's about a 50-minute long podcast on the subject of miracles. Norman Geisler has contributed to a couple books, When Skeptics Ask and the Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics. And then there's really, this is really kind of a classic work here by Greg Keener. I say classic, not in the sense that it's all that old. It actually was written not too recently, but it's actually 2 volumes of his research on the subject of miracles all over the world. And it's just a massive piece of work in which he not only talks about some of the things we're going to talk about today, about the possibility of miracles and the arguments against miracles and David Hume's arguments against miracles and that sort of thing, but the bulk of his book is detailing literally thousands of miracles for which there are eyewitness accounts or there's medical records for or whatever, and he just details just numerous miracles from throughout history and across the world, even contemporary. And then William Lane Craig deals with the subject of miracles in his book on reasonable faith. Now, part of the problem with miracles is just because of the way we talk about miracles, it can be very, very confusing. So, do any of you recognize that picture? Okay. Do you know what that's a reference to?
1980 hockey
Yeah, 1980. Was anybody awake? Was anybody alive at that time? Okay, I watched that game. Okay, this is actually, and actually, I don't know if this photo is from the movie about it, or whether or not it's the actual photo of the event. I'm not sure about that photo. But of course, this is the conclusion of the American versus Russian, or Soviet actually at the time, hockey team. And of course, the Soviets were the world leaders in hockey, and Americans have never been all that great at it. And so when the Americans beat the Soviets in the actually this was a semifinal round, and then they went on and played the Canadians and beat them to win the gold medal. But oftentimes that's referred to as the miracle on ice, right? Well, you know, I watched that game, and it was a pretty exciting game, but I don't remember seeing any miracles, right? But we call it the miracle on ice because it's so unusual. It was so unexpected, and for us as Americans, we call it a miracle because, you know, it was so wonderful. You know, I don't think the Russians really kind of viewed it that way, but at any rate. So that raises the issue of how we use the term miracles when we talk about miracles. And we tend to have kind of a cavalier use of the word miracle. So I just came across something I was reading, or something I heard just in the last couple of weeks, and I don't even remember what it was now, but somebody was referring to a particular event as a miracle, you know, when it very clearly was not what we would normally think of as a miracle. And so one of the things I want to encourage us to think about is how we use the word, and be careful how we use the word. Because I think when we use the word miracle to describe things that really aren't miraculous, they may be wonderful and they may be highly unusual, but there's very clearly a natural cause for them, or there's, you know, it just seems that the causes are natural. When we use the word miracle to refer to those kind of things, I think what it tends to do, certainly in some people's minds, is it lowers their concept of what a miracle really is, right? And so Lennox has a point that I think is really good. He says, the only thing that will kill the possibility of miracles, and he doesn't mean whether or not miracles are really possible, but whether or not people think miracles are possible, okay? So he says, the only thing that will kill the possibility of miracles more quickly than a committed materialism is the claiming of miracle status for everyday events for which natural explanations are readily at hand. So one of the things I want us to learn to do is, I hope we learn, you know, to be very careful about using the term miracle when it really doesn't apply. So this brings up then the question of different kinds of unusual events, okay? And I got this list, I borrowed this list from, or stole this list from Frank Turek. But I think it's a very helpful list of different kinds of unusual events. And for us to be aware of those so that we can kind of properly categorize things. So first he just talks about anomalies. So anomalies are just, you know, freaks of nature. And so the power that's behind, the power that's working, or the force that's working in an anomaly, of course, is just simply nature, but it's a highly unusual event, okay? And so an example would be an albino frog, okay? So you see an albino frog, and it's very strange, it's very bizarre, very unusual, but there are natural explanations for why it happened and how it happened, something in the genes of the frog, okay? A second category would be magic. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I love watching magic shows. They're just a lot of fun to watch, okay? But magic is nothing more than an illusion, right? So the force, the power, the cause behind magic is strictly human. It appears to be very unnatural. Whatever's happening is really weird and inexplicable, okay? But clearly, there's some human involvement. There's a person, a man or a woman, that's actually controlling events and making them look like it's a supernatural event when, of course, it isn't. And for this reason, historically, magic has often been used to mimic miracles. Okay, and so oftentimes when you see a miracle claim or whatever, one of the first questions that comes to people's mind is there an illusion going on here? Is there some kind of what we might call magic trick going on? So, you know, rabbit in the hat, card tricks, that sort of thing, and you've seen a lot, I've seen a lot, and my wife gets really frustrated when she sees those, and she says to me, she says, "How did they do that?" And I'm going, I have no idea how they did that. I can't explain it, but I do know what's happening here, that this is magic, that this is an illusion. The next classification of unusual events would be psychosomatic events, okay? And the power that's operating in psychosomatic events is the human mind. It's the human mind is at work in accomplishing this, okay? So again, they're highly unusual, they're very singular types of events. They may appear to some degree to be supernatural. They're very hard to explain. But what they require to have them is what some people call faith, but actually what it is it's just a very intense high level of mental concentration. Enables the person to do things that a person might not normally be able to do. And it works for some people, and other people it doesn't work for. The fourth category would be satanic or demonic activity, okay? So the power behind this, of course, would be an evil or demonic power. And one of the characteristics of demonic activity is there's always some kind of deception or falsehood involved. And what I mean by that is not that the event itself is deceptive or not real. The event is real, but it's being used to lead people astray, okay? So for example, in the Old Testament, the Lord in the Pentateuch warns the people of Israel about prophets who could actually prophesy for future events, but they're doing it to lead people away from God. He says, you know that's not me doing that. That's satanic power in place. So an example of that would be the strength of the Gerasene demoniac in Mark chapter 5, where there's this guy who cannot be restrained. They put chains on him, he breaks the chains and that sort of thing, and of course ultimately Jesus heals him. And then that brings us to the last couple categories that have divine source or divine origin. And the first of these is providence, okay? So in providential events, what you have is events that seem some way to be prearranged, or events seem to just kind of flow in a direction that accomplishes the particular event that's in question. And the power behind these are divine, that God is at work in these, okay? But the difference between a miracle and a providential event is providential events can be explained naturally. All right. So some examples of that. I don't know if you're a student of World War II, but when the Allies invaded Normandy on June 6, 1944, there was an unusual fog, just kind of unexpected fog that settled in right at the time of the invasion, and it actually served to the advantage of the Allies because it concealed the fleet as it was moving across the channel towards Normandy. And so there are many people who believe that that was a providential act of God, but of course it's completely naturally understandable, you know, than just whatever the laws of nature are at work. But the another example of that is in the scripture is the story of Esther. So you think about the story of Esther. It's a fascinating story because if you read through the book of Esther, you get to the end of it and you go, wow, that's really cool what God did, right? But what's interesting is God's never mentioned anywhere in the book of Esther. The name of God is never mentioned. The closest you come to an implication of God's involvement in the text itself is where Esther is told, who knows but you may have attained this position for such a time as this. You know, implies there's some higher power at work, right? So you have this remarkable event to save the children of Israel, to save the Jews, okay? And it's a series of what appear to be just simple coincidences, okay? But it's very clear that the story is in there so that we'll understand that God was at work behind the scenes orchestrating events to bring about His purpose of salvation. So that's the story of Esther. And then our last category then would be miracles. And miracles are, again, divine act. The power that's behind them is supernatural. So something is happening which is superseding the normal capabilities of nature and the normal causation in nature. Miracles never fail. They are immediate, enduring. They bring glory to God. There'd be a little bit of debate about the question of the immediacy. I know Ronnie, I believe, believes all miracles are immediate. Frank Turek, I believe, includes immediate in his list, as I recall. I'm not personally convinced that every miracle is an immediate miracle. In fact, I think I have seen one personally that was not, did not appear at all to be an immediate. It appeared to be a miracle that took place over a period of time. But at any rate, that's a general description of miracles. So things like raising the dead, the raising of the axe head in the story of Elisha, the healing of the withered hand, and we can think of all kinds of miracles in the Scriptures. Okay? Now, what we encounter today, though, of course, in the Western world is there's a great deal of presupposition or bias against miracles today in the West, okay? And so there are several characters who have played a significant role in shaping the way Westerners think about miracles. And one of them is this Dutch philosopher, Spinoza, back in the 17th century. And he argued that miracles were impossible because to him a miracle was a violation or contradiction of the laws of nature, and he was a pantheist. Okay? So nature and God were one. And so to him, now that we know that there are laws of nature, it would be to have something that would go against the law of nature would be something to go against the nature of God. So to him, miracles were impossible. And then in the next century, you have this Scottish philosopher by the name of David Hume. We've mentioned him before. And he was a skeptic. He was a non-Christian, not a Christian. And he defined a miracle as specifically as a violation of the laws of nature. Okay. And in his judgment, because they were a violation of the law of nature, they could not occur. All right. And I think that should be maybe a clue to us that definition of a miracle as a violation of the laws of nature is a problematic definition. We'll talk more about this in a moment. But oftentimes you hear Christians, when they define a miracle, they'll define a miracle as a violation of the laws of nature. And I think it'd be best if we stay away from that. I understand why people use that definition, but I think it'd be best if we stay away from it because it tends to prejudice the discussion against miracles, okay? Which it certainly did with David Hume. And Hume had a couple main lines of argument, and he was profoundly influential. Not so much in his own day, because there were a number of thinkers and writers who were very critical of him at the time that he wrote. But as the Enlightenment mentality really settled in and got its roots down in Western culture in the following century or two, Hume's ideas really became kind of the last word on miracles for many people. So he was very, very influential up until about the last 40 years or so. And so he had kind of two arguments, and one was that in principle you could never know whether or not a miracle had occurred, okay? Because he said, even if you had complete, what he called full proof of a miracle, that would not be enough to believe in the miracle, because against the full proof of the miracle, you have also the full proof of the regularity of nature, the laws of nature. And the laws of nature are just so overwhelming that even if you had full proof of miracle, even if you saw a miracle with your own eyes, you wouldn't have reason to believe it, because you know that the regularity of nature and the laws of nature would not allow a miracle to happen. Okay? And then the second line of argument, so his first line of argument is the in principle argument. The second is the in fact argument. He said it would, in fact, it would be impossible to ever find sufficient proof for a miracle, he says, because, according to him, a miracle would run counter to what he called universal human experience. So what he's saying is nobody's ever seen a miracle. Nobody's ever actually encountered a miracle. And so really the only reason that miracle claims arise is because they arise among what he called primitive and barbarous people. So basically what he's saying, in the old days, in ancient days, before people knew about science, and they were just ignorant, stupid people, they would believe in miracles. And the only reason we believe in those miracles today is just because we've heard the stories and we believe the stories. But those stories only arose among primitive and barbarous people. Okay? And so, so miracles run counter, he says, the claim of miracles run counter to this universal human experience. Okay? But there's actually a number of individuals, but one in particular who really challenged Hume's ideas. And one of them is, we've talked about before, William Paley, who was an English theologian and philosopher. And he wrote a few years after Hume, and he vigorously challenged Hume's presuppositions and Hume's arguments. He demonstrated that Hume's arguments were circular, and that it was possible to have sufficient evidence for a miracle. And he was only one of a number who did. But as I say, as time went on, Hume's thoughts and Hume's arguments gained more and more traction and became, certainly in the secular world, became kind of the last word on miracles up until about the 1970s, 1980s, in that period of time, okay, when they finally began to really be exposed for what they were. Craig Keener, who I mentioned wrote the 2-volume kind of definitive work on miracles, defines miracles as an extraordinary event with an unusual supernatural cause, okay? And so as we unpack that a little bit, and I think this is a more helpful definition than to just call it a violation of the laws of nature, okay? So there are several things that kind of come out here. One is a miracle is what we might call a singular, an extraordinary event, very unusual event, for which there is no explanatory natural cause. So there's no cause, there's no natural cause that explains. Now I'm not saying that we don't have a natural explanation. I'm saying there is no natural explanation. Okay, so it's a singular, or we might call it a singularity. Okay, event for which there's no natural cause that's operating according to what we understand to be the laws of nature. Right. In addition to that, it is an act of God which inspires awe. It inspires wonder. So one of the elements of miracles then is they function to some measure they function as a sign. They have a significance to them. Okay? For example, the Greek word dunamis is the word that's oftentimes translated as miracles in our Bible, in our English Bibles. And that word, dunamis, or power, means power, is frequently associated in our Bible text, is associated with phrases like signs and wonders, that are translated signs and wonders. And that Greek word, or that word signs there, comes from the Greek word semeion, which has the idea of sign or signification in it. Okay? So miracles then are associated with this idea of some signification, some message, some sign, or something any particular context. Okay, so in other words, when a miracle happens, it happens in a context so that the miracle conveys something. It signifies something, right? So what that means is that in looking at an event and trying to understand an event and whether or not it's a miracle, we have to take into consideration the context in which it occurs. Okay, so context is crucial. And so in trying to determine if it's a miracle or if it's demonic activity or psychosomatic or whatever, if we're trying to determine that, one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, what is the context? And is the context what we could say, is it spiritually charged? Is there a spiritually charged context to it? So, for example, you think about the resurrection of Jesus. So, if we had the resurrection of Jesus, we had this man from Nazareth who died, was crucified or however he died, and then we had some historical claim that he rose from the dead. But we knew nothing else about Jesus. We didn't know about his birth, we didn't know about his life, we didn't know about his teachings, we didn't know about the miracles he supposedly did, we didn't know any of that, we didn't know about his claims to deity, we didn't know about his messianic claims, we didn't know about his conflict with the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders, we didn't know that he was crucified because of those claims. Okay. If we didn't know any of that, all we knew was that there was a man who supposedly died and rose again, then the resurrection of Jesus would be a completely ambiguous event. We wouldn't, it wouldn't signify anything to us, right? It wouldn't communicate it. So it's the spiritually charged context of Christ's death and resurrection that imbues it with that significance that helps us understand what it's trying to tell us. Okay, so context really plays an important role when we're looking at miracles. So then a miracle then is God's actions somehow in relationship to nature, right? To the way nature normally acts. And this one happens to unfold as we look in Scripture in two different ways. So one way is that you'll get a very supernatural, unusual event, a singular event, like I say, but somehow, in some way, the elements of nature play a part in the miracle. Okay? So a fascinating one to me is the example of the Red Sea. So the Red Sea is very clearly a miracle. The Scripture describes it as a miracle. The people at the time understood it was a miracle. The enemies of Israel knew it was a miracle. The Canaanites knew and understand it too. Everybody knew it was a miracle. But what's interesting is when you read the story of the Red Sea, it describes God opening the Red Sea with a great wind. Okay? So it is a miracle. It is a supernatural event. But somehow nature's playing a role. God's somehow using nature to accomplish that. Another example, of course, is that kind of strange story about Jesus healing the blind man with the mud that he made from his spittle, right? So he takes some dirt and he spits in it and he rubs it on the guy's eyes, and then he goes tells him, you go wash it off, and he goes wash it off, and then he can see. That, incidentally, to me, would be an example of a miracle that wasn't immediate. But again, you have the example of a miracle happening, but somehow natural elements play a role in it. Okay. But then at other times you get miracles that just seem completely apart from any apparent cooperation of the natural world. Okay, so the floating of the axe head, the virgin birth, the resurrection, these are miracles that occur in which nature doesn't seem to play any kind of significant role at all. Okay? And then another point on understanding miracles is that if miracles are an act of God, okay, if they occur because God is acting, then to say that miracles are impossible, so somebody might say, well, I don't believe that was a miracle, is one thing, but for somebody to say, no, miracles are not possible, in order to prove that miracles aren't possible, they'd have to prove God doesn't exist. As long as there's a possibility of a theistic God, as long as there's a possibility of a theistic God, there's a possibility of miracles, right? Because if there is a God who transcends nature, if there is a God who brought nature into existence, who created the laws of nature, as long as that's true, then miracles are possible. So somebody might say, well, I don't believe that there is a theistic God, and so therefore I don't believe in miracles. Well, that's one thing, that's their belief. But for somebody to assert, like Hume did, miracles are impossible, okay, that person, in order to prove that claim that miracles are impossible, would have to prove that a theistic God does not exist. Okay? So when we look at miracles then in the Scripture, we see them used in several different ways, and particularly three that I notice particular are miracles. Again, remember, they're used as a sign, they're used to communicate something. So they are oftentimes used to authenticate either a particular messenger or a particular message, or both. Okay, so classic example would be Elijah and the prophets of Baal, where they build the altars and they try to call down fire from Baal, and nothing happens, and then Elisha calls down fire, and you get fire on the altar that's offered up to God, the offering that's offered up to God. So what's happening there is God is performing a miracle to authenticate the message of Elisha and to authenticate his message that he is the one true and only God. Okay. A second way that miracles are oftentimes used in Scripture is for God to demonstrate his concern for and his love for his people. Okay. So an example would be Peter being delivered from prison. Okay. So here's an example of God's love and concern for the church, for Peter, and for the gospel to go out, and that sort of thing. And so you see the miracle of Peter's deliverance from prison. And then the third category would be to testify or signify God's concern for those outside of his people. Okay? So this would be for the lost, for the unsaved. Okay? And oftentimes miracles happen on behalf of the unsaved so that they will be saved. Okay? So an example of that would be Jesus' healing of the child of the Syrophoenician woman. So the woman is from Tyre. She's a Syrophoenician. She's not a Jew, but she comes to Jesus because she has a demon-possessed daughter. And first Jesus kind of puts her off because she's not a Jew, and then she's very insistent, and then God heals her daughter. And he's communicating there his love for someone who's not among the people of God. Okay? So these are three very common uses of miracles that we see in Scripture. So what are the arguments then that people bring against miracles? And there are a number of them. I've got 7 listed here, and as we have time we'll go through each one of them. But first, a miracle would violate the unchangeable laws of nature, which of course comes from Spinoza and Hume. Science, that is what we know about science now today, disproves the possibility of miracles. Miracle claims run contrary to universal human experience. So, in other words, there's no credible evidence anywhere for miracles having happened. Only primitive and barbarous people believed in miracles because they didn't know or they didn't understand the laws of nature. A miracle claim would require extraordinary evidence to be believable. Sometimes this is phrased, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, okay? And that's commonly raised as an objection to miracles. Another objection is there's clearly a lot of bogus claims out there, so why would we believe any miracle claim since there's so many bogus claims? And then finally, competing religions have miracles. Okay, so the Muslims have miracles they cite, and Christians have miracles they cite, and that sort of thing. And so, according to this argument, they cancel each other out. Okay, why would you believe any? Because they're just competing against each other. So let's take some time and look at those. So, do miracles violate the laws of nature? Well, one of the things we need to think about is how the word law is being used. So, one way we use law is in a prescriptive sense. So we talk about prescriptive laws. So these would be the way we normally think about law. So you're driving down the street and you see a street sign and it says 35 miles an hour is the speed limit. It is the prescribed limit to which you can drive, okay? That's how we often think of laws. Laws tell us how you must behave or how you must not behave, right? But there's another way that law is used, and this is the way law is being used when it's being used in a scientific context. So when we're talking in a scientific context, we're not talking about laws being prescriptive, but rather descriptive. So when you think about how laws are, how we arrive at the conclusion that there is, for example, a law of gravity, the way we do that is inductively. In other words, we look at many different things that happen over a long period of time, and they seem to happen consistently this way, and so we say, well, there is a law of gravity, okay? Now, people knew about the law of gravity long before Newton, right? So there's a law of, now, of course, Newton was able to quantify exactly what that, quote, law was, but what he was doing was he was quantifying what he was observing, what he was seeing. In other words, our conclusion that there are laws of nature comes from our deductive observations, from our inductive observations and our inductive conclusions from the observations that we make. So the question then is, are miracles violations of the laws of nature? But if the laws of nature are descriptions of what we observe that we arrived at because of our observation. So we observe the way nature operates, we observe what happens in nature, and we observe that regularity, and so then we say there's a law that's controlling that, okay? But what happens if we observe a miracle? We're observing something happening in nature, right? So how could you describe a miracle as a violation of our observations of nature if one of the things we observe about nature is that on occasion, in certain contexts, this regularity of nature doesn't hold and something else happens? We have to factor that into our, quote, laws of nature, because our laws of nature are arrived at by observation, and if I observe a dead man rising from the dead and coming back to life, I have to factor that into how I view the laws of nature, right? So we need to stay away from that idea of violations of the laws of nature. God Himself transcends those laws. He Himself created those laws. He set those laws in place. So somebody violates a law only if they are subject to the law, right? But of course, He's not subject to the law. The God of theism is not subject to the law of nature. He's the origin of it. In fact, He is the one who sustains nature, as we see in Colossians and Hebrews. So God is free to act, to intervene when He chooses in the normal processes of nature for whatever purposes He has. And then once He does that, then the new situation immediately begins to behave according to the laws of nature. So God acts, something happens, and immediately then that situation becomes enfolded in the regularity of nature. So the laws of nature are not violated. The laws of nature are not overthrown. So, and when you think about it, if you talk about the first singularity, so we talked about the origin of the cosmos, the Big Bang, or whatever it was, and scientists refer to it as the singularity, okay? And one of the reasons it's called the singularity is because it's a singular event. It never happened before, it's never happened since, right? And one of the things that happened in the singularity is the entire cosmos, time, space, and matter, and the laws of nature all come into existence. Now, if God did that, if God was able to perform that rather grandiose singularity, then He's certainly able to perform any other singularity that He wants to perform at any time that He chooses to. So I like Lewis on this, C.S. Lewis. He says, if God annihilates or deflects or creates a unit of matter, He has created a new situation at that point. Immediately, nature domiciles this new situation, makes it at home in her realm, adapts all other events to it. It finds itself conforming to all the laws. If God creates a miraculous spermatozoon in the body of a virgin, it does not proceed to break any laws. The laws at once take over. Nature is ready, Pregnancy follows according to all the normal laws, and 9 months later, a child is born. I was just reading this week some things that Blake Lindley had written about pro-life and that sort of thing. One of the things he's pointing out is the real miracle didn't happen at Christmas. Okay? At Christmas, you have the birth of a baby who's totally natural. The real miracle happened 9 months before, right? So that's where the miracle occurred. What happened on Christmas Day, whenever, on the day of Christ's birth, whatever happened there was all completely natural, right? I mean, of course, there were supernatural things going on maybe in the skies and that sort of thing, but the event itself was completely natural. It was the conception of Jesus that was supernatural. So the second point was, does science disprove the possibility of miracles? Well, of course, we have to remember the things we've talked about science is that science only knows about the natural world. Science can only study the natural world. So science can tell us that this event doesn't have a natural explanation, but science cannot tell us anything else about it. Okay? So science can't tell us whether or not an event was caused supernaturally. So science can't tell us in any way whether or not miracles occur. So Craig Keener, in his work on miracles, says scientists are experts about the normal happenings of nature. But when asking whether something outside the norm happens, they no longer speak as scientists per se, because how to address anomalies or metanormal phenomena is a philosophical, or I might add a theological, question. Okay? So when the scientist says something about the possibility of miracles, he's no longer speaking as a scientist. He's speaking as a philosopher. And whatever his qualifications are to be a philosopher, that's another question altogether. Right? So the claim that science denies the possibility of miracles then is not a scientific claim. It's a philosophical claim that's just following in the footsteps of David Hume's philosophical claims. So David Hume's claims were philosophically based, they weren't scientifically based. And so the person who denies the possibility of miracles is not doing so on the basis of science. So are miracle claims contrary to universal human experience? And what's interesting here is, of course, this was Hume's claim, and Paley points out that this argument is fallacious, and one of the reasons it's fallacious is because it's a circular argument. Okay? So the argument is presupposing what it's assuming. So it's assuming there never were any miracles. All right? So that means nobody in human history has ever experienced a miracle. So I'm going to reject miracles because nobody in history has ever experienced a miracle, but I'm presuming that nobody's ever experienced miracles. It's a circular argument, right? So it's a fallacy. Paley pointed that out a long time ago, and particularly in the last 30 or 40 years, many philosophers are now coming to recognize very clearly the circular nature of Hume's argument. In addition, Paley and many others since Paley have, and particularly within the last number of years, have shown, contrary to what Hume says, that it is possible to have credible witnesses to a miracle. All right? And one of the reasons for this is Hume's argument runs counter to what we now know about evaluating competing claims. Okay, so if we go back to our lessons on argumentation many moons ago, right, and we talked about two ways to evaluating competing claims or competing hypotheses or competing explanations. And we talked about inference to the best explanation. This is the way most of us do it most of the time when we're trying to evaluate competing claims. Is we use things like explanatory scope and explanatory power and how ad hoc is the explanation And how well does this explanation work with other things we already know? These are methods that most of us use when we're evaluating competing claims. Okay, but I also showed you Bayes' theorem. So you remember Bayes' theorem? It was that mathematical formula, and we talked about it, and I said, okay, this is hard to grasp, but it's there, and I want you to be familiar with it. Well, one of the reasons we need to be familiar with it is because it's become tremendously influential in the last 20, 30, 40 years in demolishing Hume. So a number of philosophers employing Bayesian methodology started to approach Hume's arguments in the hopes that Bayesian methodology would demonstrate the power of Hume's argument, and just the opposite happened. As they began to apply Bayesian methodology to Hume's argument, it became very clear that Hume's argument was wrong and that it is possible to have very credible claims for miracles. And that's a very involved argument, so we won't have time to go into it, but it's very fascinating argument. In addition to that, the research that others have done, but particularly the research that Craig Keener has done all over the world, in all different regions of the world, including in the West, has demonstrated that there is just a vast amount of evidence for miracles. There's a vast amount of evidence available for miracles in history, and there's a vast amount of evidence for miracles across the world in all regions of the world. And this includes even contemporary miracles, miracles that are happening even today. So there are miracles that have happened, and there are miracles that are happening today, and many of those miracles have been what we would call scientifically documented, been documented by medical records and things like that. But then the question arises, and many people ask, well, why don't we see more miracles, particularly here in the West? Okay, so it's interesting in Craig's work, of the many thousands of miracles that he documents, many of them happen, excuse me, in what he calls the majority world, the non-Western world. But he does have some from the Western. He does have some in the Western world. So the question is, why do we as Westerners not see many miracles? And I would suggest to you there's a couple things to keep in mind. One is, a miracle by definition is rare, right? If it weren't rare, it wouldn't be a miracle. It'd be a law of nature, right? So miracles by definition have to be rare, or they wouldn't serve their purpose as a sign, right? If you had a speed limit sign every 10 feet, you know, pretty soon you wouldn't pay any attention to speed limit signs, right? You just, you know, you'd be blind to them. You wouldn't see them, all right? Well, the same is true with miracles, okay? If miracles just constantly were happening to us all the time, they wouldn't serve to signify things quite as powerfully as they do. The second thing is, if miracles just happened all the time, if the causal works of nature were just constantly being altered, then we wouldn't be able to live life, because we wouldn't be able to predict, you know, what would happen if we got up in the morning and went to work. We wouldn't be able to predict if our car, well, you may not be able to predict if your car is going to start anyway, but that's according to the laws of nature. But you just couldn't live life if miracles were just constantly happening around us all the time, okay? But particularly in the West, I think we have a problem. And I think that's because in the West, particularly since the Enlightenment, we have a bias against miracles. We have just a real high level of skepticism about miracles, right? And that skepticism isn't shared by the majority world. The majority world is much more open to the idea of miracles than we are. Not because they're stupid, but just because they haven't been indoctrinated by Enlightenment reasoning, right? And so what's at play here is that faith is a crucial element in miracles. Not in all miracles, okay? But certainly in many miracles, faith plays an important role. And the problem is that here in the West, we don't have faith in the possibility of miracles. We don't believe it. So even many Christians are highly skeptical and suspicious about miracles and miracle claims, right? That's just the way we are in the West. And what this does is that brings to mind Jesus' situation in Nazareth. So you remember Jesus goes into Nazareth. He's been doing miracles all over the place, and he goes into Nazareth, but it says that when he goes to Nazareth, he can't do many miracles there. He doesn't do many miracles in Nazareth, he says, because of their unbelief. And so I would suggest to you that one of the reasons we don't see more miracles than we do see here in the West is because we are so biased against them. We are so skeptical and so unbelieving that we don't see more miracles than we would otherwise see. Do only primitive and barbarous people believe in miracles? Well, primitive people, barbarous people, they understood the exceptionalist nature, exceptionalist regularity of nature. They understood that, right? You probably could never have found a primitive, barbarous person who didn't understand that if he dropped a rock it would fall to the ground, right? They understood that, right? So that's why miracles were so powerful to them. Miracles were powerful to them and struck awe in their hearts because when they saw it, they realized this is not how nature works, right? So I love what N.T. Wright says in his book, The Resurrection of the Son of God. He says, proposing that Jesus of Nazareth was raised from the dead was just as controversial 1900 years ago as it is today. The discovery that dead people stayed dead was not first made by philosophers of the Enlightenment. And so I think it's just kind of an arrogant attitude on the part of us, kind of what I call chronological. Actually, C.S. Lewis, I think, coined the phrase chronological snobbery, that thinks that we're just so much more intelligent than ancient people that, you know, they would accept miracles and we would. So miracles were viewed as miracles by primitive people and evoked astonishment in their hearts precisely because they understood the constancy and the regularity of nature. They understood that, and that's why miracles were so powerful to them. So when they saw the feeding of the 5,000, when they saw water being changed into wine, when they saw the dead being raised, they were astonished at that because they knew things don't usually work this way. Something unusual is afoot. Okay? Do miracle claims require extraordinary evidence? And again, this is oftentimes raised, as I said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That sounds very reasonable on the face, but it turns out it's false. Okay? Extraordinary claims do not require extraordinary evidence. And so oftentimes what's kind of being communicated there is I'll believe your miracle claim if the evidence you give me is as astonishing and miraculous as the claim itself. Okay? Well, that gets pretty ambiguous because then you begin to wonder, well, what do you mean? What kind of evidence are you really asking for when you're saying you need evidence that's as astonishing or extraordinary as the claim itself? And I suspect that for many people what they're really saying is, it doesn't matter what evidence you give me, I'm not going to believe it. Okay? I think that's what many of them are really saying. Okay? There's no evidence that would ever convince me that a miracle happened, even if I saw it with my own eyes. Right? But in reality, and Bayesian methodology is really helpful in pointing this out, in reality, if you have a body of evidence, so you've got a miracle claim here, and you've got a body of evidence that you're saying, or somebody is saying, is evidence that the miracle happened. Okay? The only thing you have to establish, this body of evidence doesn't have to be particularly extraordinary, doesn't have to be miraculous in itself. The only question is it easier to explain, is it more probable to explain this body of evidence on the miracle having happened than it is to explain this evidence if the miracle didn't happen? So I've got this body of evidence. What's the best explanation for that body of evidence? Is it a miracle or is it some natural explanation or a denial of the miracle, right? And William Lane Craig puts it this way. He says, what is crucial is the evidence be far more probable, given that the event did occur, than given that it did not. The bottom line is that it doesn't always take a huge amount of evidence to establish a miracle. Okay? So we don't have to have particularly extraordinary evidence for miracles. And then there's the question of bogus claims. I'm kind of running out of time here, so I'm going to just go through this real quick. The whole idea here is that because there are so many bogus claims, then you're not warranted in believing any miracles. Well, I would say to you, well, that's fine. Since there's a whole lot of bogus currency out there, why don't you just give me all your dollar bills and all your $20 bills, right? Because you don't know whether they're bogus or not, right? So it's just a fallacious argument to suggest that because there's bogus claims out there, there's not a reality, right? And then the seventh one was this idea of competing claims. So you have miracle claims in other religions, you have miracle claims in Christianity. But there's several things to keep in mind. One is, we don't know the mind of God. So we don't know if God might have a reason to do a miracle on behalf of somebody in another religion. He might. And he might be trying to communicate something. They might be misinterpreting it. Okay? So we don't know that. So we can't just automatically say God would never do a miracle for a Muslim. Right? So we just need to keep that in mind. We don't have the mind of God when it comes to miracles. The second thing is, we've seen there's a whole list of different kinds of unusual events. And everything that gets called a miracle, including winning a hockey game, is not a miracle, right? So just because somebody in another religion is claiming something is miraculous that happened, doesn't mean necessarily that it was. Further, not all miracle claims, some are bogus, not all miracle claims have the same level of credibility. So there's no comparison. So there are some miracle claims for Muhammad, most of them made after he died. There are claims about miracles that Muhammad performed, okay? But they have no comparison historically, as far as historical evidence, to the miracle claims. So we have eyewitness accounts, historical eyewitness accounts of the resurrection, or excuse me, of the miracles, including the resurrection, right? So the level of credibility is considerably different. And then, of course, we also have to take in the possibility that there's demonic activity, there's satanic activity that may give the appearance of a miracle and may in fact be supernatural, but it's not a miracle. Okay. Well, we're out of time. You have a list of concluding points there. But the main thing I just want to stress is miracles are possible. They have happened in the past. We have substantial credible evidence for them. When we get into, we're going to come back to this subject of miracles when we get into the life of Jesus and when we get to the resurrection, and we'll talk about it again some more. But we have substantial evidence for miracles both in the past and even today. And I would just encourage you to have confidence that God is still doing miracles today, and He may have some He wants to do in your life, or He may have some He wants to do in the life of others. They're not going to happen every day. They're not going to happen every time you pray, okay? But just be open to the idea and the thought, because I think oftentimes, as I've said, I think it's our unbelief oftentimes that prevents God from doing some things that He would really love to do in our lives. Okay? So next week we're going to get into the authority and the reliability of Scripture. Okay?